React is a popular front-end library for application development. It was created by Facebook back in 2013 in an attempt to build apps that were more responsive, highly performant, and allow for what's called reusable components to be used throughout the app. So an example of this would be a button. So you have a button that's used throughout the application, but you want it to be the same style, so it has to look the same, it has to perform the same. Now the easiest way to do this is to create what's called a reusable component, and in this video I'll show you how to do that, but also how React renders components as well. My name is Keem, and my mission is to educate you on Web3 development in e-commerce. So let's begin. First, make sure you have the following installed: Node.js of version 14 or higher. Make sure you have a code editor installed. In this tutorial, I will be using Visual Studio Code. And some basic knowledge of the terminal or command line if you're using Windows. I have VS Code up to the left side and Chrome up to the right. So in the terminal in VS Code, I'm going to do Control backtick to load up the terminal and then run this command. So npm create vite, enter. And then it will ask you for the project name. I'll just keep it as React 101. The framework will be React, not pre-React, just React. And for now, we'll stick with JavaScript, but in a future video, I will dive into TypeScript because it is the industry standard. And in order to succeed, you have to know TypeScript. It's so powerful, and I'll be teaching that soon. JavaScript, cool. So now we're gonna copy this, paste it in the terminal, press enter. And then I'm also going to open the folder in VS Code right now, so just 1 second. So this is the application folder here that we just made. We have the source folder, which is what the UI actually, which is what's rendered by the UI itself. A public folder, which is just for public-facing images, and a nodes modules, which contains all the dependencies for this project to run. So in this video, it will be about React basics. So we mentioned reusable components, but I also want to talk about lifecycle hooks. So how React actually renders and how it re-renders. So in app.jsx, so first of all, let me just run the command again. So it was npm run dev, right? So what you're seeing here is app.jsx. We have the logos. This one's animating with CSS. Title, and then this right here is a button, and this button is what we're going to turn into a reusable component, because right now it's just right here inside the HTML or JSX, sorry. In React, you don't use HTML, it's JSX. What you're seeing right now is the boilerplate code that comes along when you start a new React app, okay? And app.jsx here is a functional component, which means that it exists as a function as opposed to a class-based component, which is what React used to use and some people still use to this day. But modern React uses functional components, and here we're exporting the default function. That means that when you import it into another file, you can name it anything you want. So default exports mean you can name it anything you want, but it's easier to just export it up here. React relies on lifecycle hooks, as I mentioned, to efficiently render content in the virtual DOM. Now the virtual DOM is a fake version of the normal DOM. So instead of using HTML, React uses JSX or React elements to render what you see right here. There's 3 main phases of lifecycle hooks, which are mount, change, and unmount. And rendering, the term rendering just means that the component is being reloaded, and all the JSX gets reloaded with new data, which is triggered by some sort of change within this component or another component, right? In functional components, we use what's called use effects, which looks like this. Now, this is a lifecycle hook that gets called in certain conditions and can execute code within it. Right now, this hook will get called every single time there's any sort of change. So if I open up the console, which is Option Command I on Mac, if I console log in here, render, and then I click on this button, so that's re-rendering constantly. But you never want to use user effect like this, really. You want to have a dependency of some kind. So this empty array here means on mount. So when the component first loads, execute console log. So if I save this, right, and I increment button, see how it's not actually causing the console log to be called. It's not re-rendering the component, right? Since this only gets called once. However, if I wanted to have similar functionality to what we had before, I would do the same hook, so use effect, but I would pass through a dependency. So I'd pass through what's it called? Count. So count will go in here. Render, call it on change count. So that'll get called twice because it gets rendered the first time. And then if I click count, only this one gets called because we're depending on count, which is changing. So it's only going to call when this state variable here changes. Okay, amazing. So finally is what's called on unmount or on destroy. So whenever the component dies, basically, it can call another hook here. So use effects. Oh, jeez. Callback function, and then in this, so we don't actually need, for this example, we don't need that. Basically, you would have a return statement here, and then within this return statement, you would say console.log on unmount, like that. So this will get called whenever it dies, which is hard to see right now because because app.jsx is the only one on the screen. You won't see anything. But let's say if we had a page, right? So we were changing pages, and there was some running process in this application. For example, if I wanted to subscribe to, I'll use a Web3 example. So in Web3, we can watch what's called on-chain events. So whenever some smart contract does whenever a smart contract triggers a function which emits an event, we can watch for events in the front end. That's what events are really for. So if I'm subscribing or watching an event within the first on mount hook, I want to unsubscribe from that watch event so I don't get what's called a memory leak in the application. And these are detrimental to React applications and all applications in general. But if you don't unsubscribe within this on unmount or on destroy hook, you're going to get memory leaks and the app's going to be really, really slow. So make sure to do that. Okay, so now let's turn this button into an actual reusable component. What I'm going to do is make a new file over here, call it button.jsx, and then this is how you define a new React component. So const button, like that. And we're going to stick with the export default syntax for now because it's used before. And then you have to have a return statement. Within this return statement, there can only be one parent div or parent JSX element. For example, if I had like button like this, right, there has to just be one parent here. Whereas if I did this, if I had a div here like this, it errors out. So you can only have one parent element in any component in React. So just keep that in mind. All right, so I'm literally going to just copy this in here. This onClick event is listening for a click. So when you click on the button, it has this callback function for this state hook Now the state hook is what updates the state variable we saw back in here. But obviously in its own component, there is no state variable that we've defined. So we have two options. We could define the state variable in the button, or we could use what's called a callback from the child to the parent and keep the state in the parent. And this is merely just a dumb component. You have two options here. You can either pass through a generic object called props that contains the actual props or properties that you want. So in this case, there's count here, and there's a set count state function. If I wanted to access the count variable in this dumb component, I would do like props dot count like that. Now in JavaScript, we don't know what this props could contain. It could be anything, a string, a number, a boolean. We have no idea. That's why TypeScript is so essential. But for now, we're not going to do that because it's not best practices. So we're going to get rid of that, leave it as count. And then this is called object destructuring, where you take the property values from an object specifically. So instead of doing props dot count, we just simply get rid of that, curly braces, and then we have counts on click as well. So you'll see why in a moment. So we have count on click, right? Get rid of this set count. We don't need this anymore. And instead, you can just pass through on click like that. And now React knows that this is a callback function without you having to define it. And then here, count, again, could be anything of any type. But we know that it's a button, that it's a number from this set state here. Right, so this is a dumb component. Let's save it. Go over to app.jsx. Now we've got to import at the top. Button, like that. And then let's delete this down here. And now, simply going to put in button, like this. But obviously, let's hit save. There's no button, there's no count here. If I click on it, it doesn't do anything because we need to pass through the props. So this is called props. So in React, we have a reusable component and we need to pass through count on click. So count will be equal to the count that we have defined up here. Okay, so on click as well, we're not going to use a set state function directly in there. Instead, we're going to use another callback function, handle click. Now, a common mistake I see with use states is that people try to update it using a reference to the count variable itself. So for example, you'll see people do set count, and then they'll do count +1. Now the problem with this is that trying to access a state variable that could have changed by this point. Now, the real way to do this is to use a callback again. So you want to access the current value, or the previous value. So previous callback function, and then do previous +1. This is a correct way to handle it. Now, another gotcha moment is that people expect the count state variable to have been updated instantly, and they try and access it within the function or the next function call. But this is asynchronous, so it will still appear as the previous, and I'll show you what I mean in a moment. Okay, so we have a before and after here in the handle click. Now you would expect the after count to be different. So if it was 2 before, 3 afterwards, 5, 6, 7, 8. But if I click on this count here, it's actually the same, right? This is before. Why is it not calling after? Oh, I didn't hit save. See, before, after, 10, 10. So keep this in mind because this gets a lot of people. It is updating, as you can see, because in the next time I click it, the number's incremented. But make sure to keep that in mind and don't try and access the state variable within that same function or in the series of function calls that you're trying to do. Great, so in summary, you've learned how React renders its components, what reusable components are. We've separated the state from the presentation here, so it's just a DOM component, and how to integrate it into an application with UseEffect. Thank you for watching. For more tutorials on app development, check out my recent video on how to make a Web3 app. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.